It was just past 8 a.m. on a crisp fall morning in Boise, Idaho. The roadside diner, nestled between a gas station and a shuttered bookstore, was coming alive with the scent of frying bacon and freshly brewed coffee. Locals knew it as Annie's Place, a no-frills, mom-and-pop kind of spot where the waitress remembered your name and how you took your eggs. Behind the counter stood Maggie, 45, wearing a faded apron and a kind of tired smile that still managed to warm the soul. She wasn't glamorous. She wasn't loud. But every regular who came through the door knew one thing: if you needed someone to talk to, Maggie would find a minute for you. She always did. Especially for the lonely ones. That morning, she was refilling the sugar containers when she noticed something different. A man she hadn't seen before, distinguished, maybe mid-60s, dressed in a tailored gray coat, had taken a corner booth. Across from him sat a little boy, maybe 8 years old, his hands clamped tightly in his lap. He didn't speak. He didn't move. His eyes never left the table. Maggie could tell right away, something was wrong. The man, Thomas Weller, though she didn't know his name yet, gave off the kind of stillness that only comes from holding too much grief for far too long. He glanced nervously at his son, like he was waiting for something to go wrong. The boy Ben sat frozen, his body locked in a shell invisible to everyone but his father. Maggie approached their table gently, menu in hand, but before she could speak, it happened. From the kitchen, a clatter, a plate shattered against the linoleum floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the small space. Dishes stopped clinking. Conversations paused. And Ben, he began to tremble. His breath quickened. He let out a small, broken whimper. Then he slid under the table, curling into himself like a wounded animal. Thomas stood immediately, panic rising in his face. "Ben," he said softly, crouching down, unsure whether to touch him, afraid to make things worse. It was clear this wasn't the first time. No one in the diner knew what to do. All eyes turned away, awkward and unsure. Except Maggie. She didn't rush. She didn't speak. She knelt down slowly, a few feet away from the boy, resting her hands on her knees. She stayed there, breathing with him. Quiet. Present. Then, without a word, she opened her arms. She didn't move closer. Didn't urge him. Just held the space. Seconds passed. Then more. And then, something no one expected. Ben shifted. His fingers, clenched so tightly, began to loosen. His body, still shaking, inched forward. Inch by inch. Until finally, with a soft gasp, he crawled into Maggie's arms. She wrapped them around him, gently as if he might break, and just held him. No words. No instructions. Just warmth and stillness. The diner was silent. Thomas stood frozen, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. For over a year, since the accident that had taken his wife, his son had recoiled from every hand, every therapist, every attempt to reach him. He had screamed at his teachers, hit nurses, and withdrawn into silence that not even the best specialists could penetrate. But here, in a small-town diner, with a waitress who smelled like coffee and lavender dish soap, Ben had let himself be held. Thomas felt something in his chest collapse. Relief? Confusion? Awe? He didn't know. He just knew this woman, this stranger, had done what no one else could. If this moment touched you, stay tuned for the next chapter in Maggie and Ben's incredible journey. And if you believe in the power of quiet kindness, don't forget to like and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD for more stories that restore your faith in humanity. The next morning, Maggie was back behind the counter at Annie's Place, pouring coffee like nothing had changed. But something had. Something had shifted deep in her chest, in that space where sorrow once sat like a stone. She couldn't stop thinking about that boy, about the way he'd melted into her arms, about the raw tremble in his little frame, and how he'd held onto her like she was the last safe place in the world. She didn't expect to see them again. So when a sleek black town car pulled up outside the diner just after the morning rush, Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and stared through the foggy window, confused. The driver stepped out, a tall man in a dark suit, and walked through the door like he already knew who he was looking for. "Maggie?" he asked gently. She blinked. "Yes. Mr. Thomas Weller would like to speak with you. He's waiting." Her heart skipped. She hadn't even known his name. The drive was silent. Maggie sat in the back seat, her hands folded in her lap, eyes darting to the world outside. She'd never been to this part of town, gated communities, sprawling estates hidden behind iron fences and long driveways. It felt like another world. A world she didn't belong to. When they arrived, the driver opened the door with a polite nod. The house loomed before her, modern, immaculate, and cold. Maggie took a breath and stepped out. Inside, the marble floors echoed beneath her worn shoes. She was led through a sunlit corridor to a quiet sitting room, where Thomas Weller stood by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. He turned as she entered, his face unreadable. "Thank you for coming," he said. Maggie offered a polite nod, unsure of what to say. He gestured toward a chair. "Please sit." She did. Thomas hesitated, as though choosing his words carefully. "I've had experts. Therapists. Behavioral specialists. Speech pathologists. The best money could buy. But none of them reached him." Maggie lowered her gaze. "I didn't do anything special." "But you did," he said, his voice low. "You gave him something none of them could. You didn't force your way in. You waited. You let him come to you." She stayed quiet, unsure where this was going. Thomas continued, "I want to offer you a job. Not as a waitress. As something else." He paused, searching for the right phrase. As Ben's emotional companion. A friend, really. Someone he can trust. Someone who doesn't come with charts or progress reports. Maggie blinked, stunned. "I'm not qualified. I don't have degrees. I've never worked with children like him." He nodded. "I know. But Ben responded to you. That means something. Maybe it's the only thing that matters right now." Silence settled between them. Then Maggie spoke, her voice softer. "I lost my son. 10 years old. Leukemia. It took everything I had just to keep breathing after that. There's a kind of grief that never leaves. I guess. I saw something in Ben. Something I understood." Thomas didn't reply right away. But his eyes softened. "I'm not offering you this because I expect you to fix him," he said quietly. I want to give him a chance. And I think you might be the one to help." She looked down at her hands, the calloused fingers that had scraped gum off plates and poured thousands of cups of coffee. And yet, here she was, being asked to step into a boy's wounded world, not as a therapist, not as a savior, but as a presence. After a long pause, Maggie met his eyes. "I'm not doing this for the money." "I didn't think you were," Thomas replied. She nodded slowly. "All right then. I'll try. For Ben." And just like that, her life turned in a direction she never expected. Maggie arrived at the Weller estate just after sunrise, her old sedan looking wildly out of place against the backdrop of manicured lawns and imported stone fountains. The house was quiet. Too quiet. She clutched her thermos of cocoa like a shield, unsure of what this new chapter would demand of her. There was no handbook for what she was about to do. No checklist. No protocol. She wasn't a therapist. She wasn't trained in child psychology. All she had was a deep well of patience, a mother's instinct, and a memory that still ached whenever she thought of her son's empty bedroom back home. So she started small. Each morning, she arrived and sat in the sunroom, an airy space with high ceilings and soft cushions, flooded with golden light. She'd set down the cocoa, hum an old lullaby under her breath, and begin reading from a tattered book of fairy tales. Ben didn't join her, not at first. For 3 days, he stood in the doorway, silent and tense, watching from a distance. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just watched. Maggie didn't push. She simply read aloud, letting her voice fill the room like warm water. Then she'd leave, always with a quiet "Goodbye, Ben. I'll be here tomorrow." On the 4th day, he stepped 1 foot into the room. By the end of the 2nd week, he was sitting across from her, still silent, still guarded but closer. It wasn't much. But it was something. She kept showing up. She learned what calmed him: the smell of cinnamon, the sound of wind chimes outside, the old worn quilt she brought from home. She made cocoa with extra marshmallows and left a cup beside him without a word. He never said thank you. But one morning when she stood to leave, his small hand reached out and lightly brushed hers. She didn't cry then. She waited until she got back to her car, gripping the steering wheel, letting the tears come in waves, of hope, of grief, of something long buried starting to bloom again. But not everyone saw it the way she did. Dr. Halberd, the lead behavioral specialist hired by Thomas, pulled the billionaire aside after a month. "There's no measurable progress," he said, tapping his tablet. "No speech development, no structured therapy. What she's doing, it's not science. It's sentiment." "She's making a connection," Thomas said quietly. "With respect, Mr. Weller, connections don't rewire neural pathways. They don't develop coping mechanisms or cognitive skills. This woman is well-meaning, but she's untrained. She could do more harm than good." The tutor, a sharp woman named Regina, agreed. "Ben needs structure, routine, reinforcement. This kind of emotional indulgence, it's not sustainable." Thomas didn't respond right away. He'd seen Ben edge closer to Maggie. He'd watched him lift his head when she read, even smile faintly when she told a silly story about a dragon who lost his fire. But he hadn't heard him speak. Hadn't seen him laugh. Doubt began to creep in. Was it real? Or was it just coincidence? One night, Thomas sat in his study long after the staff had gone home, watching the security footage from the past few weeks. He fast-forwarded through long stretches of silence, of Maggie reading while Ben stared blankly. He watched her laugh gently at her own jokes, even when Ben didn't react. He saw her wait, day after day, without expectation, without reward. But then, he paused. There it was. Ben had reached for her hand. Not once, but 3 times in the last week. Each time was subtle, hesitant, but real. Thomas leaned back in his chair, conflicted. He had built empires on logic, on data, on certainty. Everything in his life had been measured, calculated, optimized. But this wasn't science. This was something else entirely. The headlines hit the news cycle like a thunderclap. Billionaire's son in care of ex-addict Waitress, hidden past exposed. It was printed in bold across a glossy tabloid, sitting on newsstands across Boise and circulating faster online. The photo was grainy, an old mugshot, taken over a decade ago, but the face was unmistakably Maggie's. Hollow-eyed. Lost. A woman barely holding on. The article pulled no punches. It detailed her past with cruel efficiency: the death of her 10-year-old son from leukemia, the spiral into grief, the months spent in a state-run rehab facility. It made no mention of the years she'd spent rebuilding her life. No word of her quiet sobriety, her time volunteering at grief centers, or the hundreds of sunrises she'd served coffee to strangers in that little diner by the road. It didn't matter. The damage was done. When Thomas saw the article, his hands trembled. He stared at the paper for a long time, his mind racing. Shame. Anger. Confusion. Mostly, hurt. She hadn't told him. She'd looked him in the eye, sat in his home, held his son's hand, and she hadn't told him the truth. What else had she hidden? He stood in his study, blinds drawn, fingers clenching the page until it crumpled. He wanted to believe it didn't change anything. that it didn't matter. But the voice of caution, honed by years of boardroom betrayals, whispered, "You were played." He called the estate manager. "Where's Maggie?" "She's gone, sir." Thomas froze. Gone. She left this morning. No notice. No belongings taken. Just this. He handed Thomas a folded envelope. No name on the outside. Just his initial. Inside, a single note, written in Maggie's uneven handwriting. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I was ashamed. I didn't think I deserved a second chance. But I wasn't here to deceive you. I was here for Ben. Because I know what it means to lose everything. And I wanted to help you keep what you still have. I'm not perfect. But I was honest where it counted. Take care of him. He's a good boy." Thomas stared at the note, the weight of it heavier than the paper itself. He felt a strange mix of guilt and betrayal. She had lied, by omission maybe, but she had been there. Every morning. Patient. Kind. Not asking for anything in return. Still, how could he trust someone who kept something so big a secret? Later that night, he sat in the sunroom where Maggie used to read. The cocoa mugs were gone. The blanket folded neatly on the armchair. It felt colder now. Emptier. Ben hadn't spoken all day. He hadn't touched his breakfast. Hadn't come out of his room. When Thomas finally walked past his son's door, he saw something that made his breath catch. Ben was curled on the floor, clutching something to his chest. It was Maggie's scarf. The one she always wore, frayed at the edges. His lips moved, barely audible. Maggie. Thomas froze. It wasn't the name that stunned him, it was the way Ben said it. With longing. With loss. It was the first time Ben had ever spoken someone's name besides Mom. Thomas felt the walls around his certainty begin to crack. He staggered back into the hallway, the note still in his pocket. Maybe she hadn't been honest about everything. But maybe, just maybe, she'd been exactly what Ben needed. The house felt different without her. It wasn't just quieter, it was heavier. Like the walls themselves had absorbed the ache of her absence. Thomas noticed it in the smallest ways. The untouched cocoa mugs in the kitchen cabinet, the silence in the sunroom, the way Ben's gaze no longer followed the doorway, as if waiting for someone who wouldn't come. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He wandered the halls, restless. His mind kept circling back to that note. Her words haunted him, not because they were dramatic, but because they were so deeply real. "I wasn't here to deceive you. I was here for Ben." Simple. Direct. Honest. He ended up outside Ben's door around midnight. He didn't knock. He just stood there, listening. What he heard stopped him cold. A soft, broken whisper. "Maggie." Thomas blinked, pressing his ear closer. Again, clearer this time. "Maggie." He pushed the door open. Ben was curled on the carpet, clutching Maggie's old scarf. The one she'd left draped over the armchair in the sunroom, the one she always wore on chilly mornings. He had it wrapped tightly in his arms like a lifeline. His eyes were closed, his lips moving slowly, repeating her name as if it might bring her back. Thomas didn't move. He couldn't. It was the first time Ben had said any name other than Mom. The first time he'd reached out for someone, and meant it. And she was gone. Thomas sank to the floor outside the room, his heart pounding with something he hadn't felt in years, regret. The next morning, he walked into the security room and asked for all the footage. Every moment Maggie had spent in the house. He watched in silence for hours. There was no drama, no theatrics. Just Maggie, showing up every day. Sitting quietly. Reading gently. Making cocoa. Folding blankets. Letting silence stretch as long as it needed to. No expectations. No demands. He fast-forwarded through the days. Ben pacing the room. Maggie humming under her breath. Ben inching closer, day by day. Then, the moment that had escaped his attention before. Ben reaching out and touching her hand. Thomas paused the footage. Rewound. Watched it again. This time, he didn't see just a boy making progress. He saw trust being built, brick by brick, breath by breath. She had never forced anything. Never pressured him. Never crossed a boundary. And in return, Ben had given her something he hadn't given anyone in over a year: connection. Thomas leaned back in the chair, rubbing his hands over his face. He had doubted her. Because of her past. Because of fear. Because it was easier to believe the tabloids than to trust what he saw with his own eyes. But now, with everything stripped away, there was only one truth that remained. Maggie had been the only one who truly reached his son. He opened the drawer of the security desk, took out the note she had left, and read it one more time. "I'm not perfect. But I was honest where it counted." He closed his eyes. And this time, he didn't try to hold the tears back. It had been 5 days since Maggie left. 5 long, silent days. The diner felt colder now. The regulars still came and went, but Maggie moved like a shadow, present, polite, but no longer truly there. Her smile had become mechanical. Her voice softer than usual. She didn't hum when she poured coffee anymore. She didn't expect to see him again. So when the bell over the door jingled and Thomas Weller stepped into the diner, heads turned. It wasn't every day a billionaire walked into Annie's place in a cashmere coat and Italian leather shoes. But Thomas didn't care about the stares. He only saw her. Maggie stood frozen behind the counter, coffee pot in hand. Her lips parted, but no words came. He walked toward her, slow, steady, eyes full of something between apology and awe. When he reached her, he didn't speak. He just lowered himself, right there on the checkered tile floor, onto one knee. Gasps filled the room. Thomas looked up at her and said, voice cracking with emotion, "I don't need someone perfect. I don't need someone with the right degree or a spotless past. I need someone with a heart. And Ben already chose you." Maggie's eyes welled. Her hand went to her mouth, but she didn't stop the tears this time. She let them fall. So did he. They stood there, 2 broken people in a little roadside diner, held together by the thread of one child's fragile trust. Later that week, Maggie returned to the estate, not as a guest, not as a stranger, but as someone who belonged. But she didn't come back to simply sit in the sunroom or pour cocoa. With Thomas's full support, she transformed one wing of the house into something new, a warm, colorful space filled with cushions, sensory blankets, soft lighting, and a gentle scent of vanilla in the air. On the wall, in bold wooden letters, read the words, "The Hug Room." It wasn't therapy. It wasn't medicine. It was simply a place where children, especially those like Ben, could feel safe enough to connect again. No pressure. No expectations. Just presence. Some of the staff called it strange. Others called it beautiful. But Maggie didn't care what anyone called it. She just showed up, every morning, with her thermos, her stories, and her open arms. On the first day the room opened, Ben didn't come. On the second day, he peeked in, then turned away. But on the third day, she was sitting on the floor, telling a story about a sleepy owl and a grumpy hedgehog when she heard footsteps, light ones, hesitant. She looked up. Ben stood in the doorway, his fingers twitching at his sides. Their eyes met. And then, without a word, he ran. Across the room, straight into her arms. He wrapped himself around her like he had that very first day in the diner. But this time, he was the one who chose it. Maggie held him close, rocking him gently as silent tears slipped down her cheeks. Thomas watched from the hallway, hand on his chest, eyes damp. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Ben had said everything that needed saying without a single word. Weeks later, other children began to come. Quiet ones. Wounded ones. some on the spectrum, some with trauma too deep for language. But they came. And in Maggie's presence, they began to reach, timidly, cautiously, toward connection. And always on the wall remained the phrase Maggie had whispered to herself every morning since. Some wounds don't need medicine, just an honest hug. In a world that often values credentials over compassion, this story reminds us that the human heart still holds the greatest power to heal. Maggie had no degrees, no titles, only empathy born from pain. And yet, it was her quiet presence that reached a child no professional could touch. For older generations who've weathered life's storms, this story speaks deeply. Our lived experiences, our scars, and our simple acts of kindness still matter. You don't need to be perfect to make a difference. Sometimes just showing up, with open arms and an open heart, is enough. As we grow older, we may feel like the world moves on without us. But remember, wisdom, patience, and love are timeless gifts. They can mend what no medicine can. So if you still have a hug to give, a story to tell, or a gentle presence to offer, you still have the power to change a life. If this story brought tears to your eyes or stirred something deep in your heart, please take a moment to leave a like. It may seem like a small gesture, but kindness, just like healing, begins with something small. And if you believe, like we do, that compassion still matters, that quiet courage and second chances can change lives, then we invite you to subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. This is where true stories live, stories that restore faith, honor everyday heroes, and remind us that love often arrives in the most unexpected ways. Your presence here means more than you know. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We'll see you again soon, with another story that might just stay with you forever.